Hi everyone, it's Darlene. Welcome to my product review of the Distress Oxide inks. I purchased 10 of the colors out of the 12 that have been released thus far. The ones that I'm missing are Vintage Photo and Iced Spruce, and the reason why I didn't get those is because I don't really use those colors very much. So we're going to do a lot today. I'm going to do some stamping, some coloring, some ink blending, so let's get started. I created a stamped color chart of all of the oxide and dye comparisons for the different colors that I have. You'll notice that fossilized amber is missing because I don't have that distress ink pad. But the one on the left is the oxide, the one on the right is the dye. So you can see they're pretty consistent. I think the fired brick is a little bit paler in the oxide, and I think the same thing about the peeled paint, it's a little paler. So anyway, these are how they stamp on paper. This is Nina Solar White, by the way. Let me just show you the physical difference between the ink pads. This is the Distress ink. This is Faded Jeans. It's just a dark ink pad. You really can't see the color. When you look at the Distress Oxide ink pad, I think it's made of the same material, but you could definitely see exactly what color you will be stamping. So that is how they differ physically. I'm going to go ahead and do some stamping. I'm using this flower from the Flower Patch set by Stampin' Up. And the first one I'm going to do is the Distress Oxide. I'm going to use the Faded Jeans, and I'm going to use some other brands as well that kind of match this dark navy color. So I'm going to ink up my stamp, and it's pretty easy to ink up, and you can see exactly the ink on your stamp as you ink it up. I'm using Nina Solar White paper. And I wanted to show you that this ink really cleans very easily. It doesn't stain your stamps at all. And I actually use my absorber to clean the oxide inks. I don't use my absorber for pigment inks because I find it kind of hardens my absorber, but I haven't had any problems with cleaning this oxide ink. The next ink is just going to be the plain old Distress ink in Faded Jeans. I also wanted to see how the oxide ink compares to a pigment ink. So I'm also going to be stamping with Memento Luxe. This is Danube Blue. It's very similar to the Faded Jeans color. I also wanted to see how it compares to my usual go-to ink, which is Stampin' Up. So this is Pacific Point. Finally, I'm going to use Simon Says Stamp Soft Navy. The Simon Says Stamp, the Hero Arts, and many of the other brands use this same kind of chemical formula for their ink. So I wanted to see how these inks compare to the oxide inks. So here are the results. I've labeled them. I've also waited a few minutes to make sure that the ink is all absorbed as it should be. And I don't know if you could tell in the video, I'm going to put some photos on the blog so you can get a closer look. But the Faded Jeans Oxide ink is really nice and solid. So definitely good from that perspective. The Faded Jeans dye is as expected, which is kind of a little bit more faded and splotchy. But I never really used my Distress inks for stamping anyway. The Memento Luxe ink is really, really pretty. I'd say it's better than the Oxide ink. It doesn't have kind of the spreading of the ink as much as the Faded Jeans does, so you get a little bit more of a crisper image. Moving down to the Stampin' Up Pacific Point, this one is the most crisp image, but it's what I would have expected because I've done dye ink comparisons before. And then finally, the Simon Says Stamp Soft Navy kind of performed as I expected. It's not quite as crisp as the Stampin' Up. But anyway, I'm just comparing them against the oxide inks, and I'd say it's a little crisper than the oxide ink. So in summary, I think with this flower stamping, the Memento Luxe pigment ink is a much crisper ink than the oxide ink. So if you're looking at it from a pigment perspective, the Memento Luxe is a little bit nicer. I thought I'd also try to stamp some sentiments here. I'm going to use the Happy Birthday from the Birthday Balloon set by Simon Says Stamp. These are the inks I'm going to compare. I have the Distress Oxide and Walnut Stain. I have another pigment ink. This is VersaFine Vintage Sepia. And then I threw in a dye ink, the Stampin' Up Early Espresso, just to compare. All right, so here we go. We have the Distress Oxide and then the Vintage Sepia and the Stampin' Up Early Espresso. Looking at the results up close, I would say that the oxide ink is a little splotchy and thick in some areas and thin in some areas. The VersaFine is definitely crisper, and of course the Stampin' Up is dye ink, and you're always going to get the best results with that. So I think I wouldn't use the oxide ink to do sentiment stamping. Pigment inks are generally really good for clear embossing, so I thought I would try clear embossing on the oxide ink as well as just the regular Distress ink. I'm using peeled paint for this one, and then I thought I'd add another pigment ink, the Avery Elle Lemongrass. I'm going to use my Flower Patch set again. This time I'm using the leaf. So here's my Oxide ink, and then here is the Distress ink, and you'll notice that it's definitely a lot splotchier on the Distress ink, but it's a lot darker. And it turns out that the Distress ink actually fades a little bit over time, but because I put some embossing powder on there pretty soon after I stamped it and didn't give it a chance to set, the color stayed that way. So you'll see that in a minute. And then here's my last stamp, the Avery Elle. I'm going to sprinkle all three of these with embossing powder, and you'll see that the powder sticks really well actually to all three of them. And then I heat it to set it. Now I know that the lemongrass is a little lighter, but I was really just comparing how well it took the embossing powder. And it looks like the Oxide and the dye peeled paint took it about the same amount, and it's hard to see in the camera. I'll have some close-ups. The Avery Elle took the embossing powder a little thicker, so it was not quite as splotchy as the other two. But honestly, there really wasn't that big of a difference between all three of them. Next, I'm going to compare the stamp ink blending between the Oxide inks and the Distress inks. I'm using Cracked Pistachio and Broken China. If you remember, last week I did a card with letters, and so I'm going to do that same exact technique here. I've pulled my letters from the Layered Letters alphabet set by Stampin' Up, and I've put it in my MISTI since I'm going to be stamping it multiple times. So I've got just some Neenah Solar White cardstock in here, and I'm going to start with my Cracked Pistachio. This is the Oxide ink. You can see how well you can see what you're stamping here to make sure you get good coverage. But I stamped it about halfway up the letters, and then I'm going to take a tissue and I'm just going to dab it right over the edge so it gets a little bit faded as it goes toward the middle. And then I'll close my MISTI so that it stamps my Cracked Pistachio. And then I'm going to repeat the same exact thing with the Broken China Oxide ink. I repeated this process again with the Oxide inks because I'm going to take one of them and spritz it with water, since the Oxide inks are notably very reactive with water, so I wanted to start testing that. Now this third one I stamped in regular Distress inks just so I could compare them. Taking a closer look at these, you can see that the Oxide inks, the first two, are very solid and they're blended just beautifully. I mean, it was a great job, and it looks so much better than the dye ink to the right, which is splotchy, and it's still blended well, which is why I used them in the first place when I did this card, but it's much smoother with the Oxide inks. So I'm going to cut off one of these Oxide samples and I'm going to spritz it with water. And we'll see what happens. It's supposed to oxidize with water, so I'm interested to see what the difference is between wet and not wet. So I just gave it a couple of spritzes from very far away, so it's a very, very light misting. And I'm going to be doing this a little bit more later. But close up, you can see actually there's really not that much of a difference. If anything, it actually bled a little bit and it wasn't as crisp of an image. So when you're spritzing it, I don't think spritzing it on white cardstock is really going to do much for you. One of the things that excited me most when I heard about these inks was their ability to stamp on darker cardstock. So I'm going to start that test with some Crumb Cake ink by Stampin' Up. I'm using Distress Oxide Spice Marmalade, and then I'm going to stamp some Stampin' Up dye ink, and then I've got another pigment ink in the comparison, the Avery Elle Fizz. If I were to stamp on darker cardstock, I would likely use a solid image. So I'm going to use this leaf from Simon Says Stamp Leaves and Scribbles. I'm going to stamp my Distress Oxide twice so that I could spritz one of them. I've got my Avery Elle, my Distress ink, dye ink, and then my Stampin' Up. So here are the results. I think that the color from the Oxide Spice Marmalade is gorgeous on the Crumb Cake cardstock. The Avery Elle was kind of faded. I wasn't very happy with that, and that is the pigment ink. And then if you look at the bottom, the Distress ink dye Marmalade is very splotchy, as you would expect, and then the Stampin' Up is just really dark. It's just not as pretty and colorful. I'm just going to grab a scissor and cut off one of these Oxide Spice Marmalades so that I could spritz it with water and compare it. You have to be really careful about spritzing because you don't want too much water to go on. So I was much closer than I was when I did the high letters, and I got too much water on it. So you can see it's already bleeding pretty significantly. So if you want to have a stamp react with water, you really need to spritz it from really far away. So you just get a very, very light mist. So you can see I have very heavy in the upper left-hand corner, and then I barely have any in the lower right-hand corner because my spritzer wasn't even because I was just too close to the cardstock. When I first did this test, I had a much more even spritz of water. So you can see on the left there, that's the one I did earlier, and the results that you would get. So you can compare the water on top of the spice marmalade versus not on top. So I think it's really pretty with the spritzing. It's much brighter. It's a lighter color, but at the same time, you have to be really careful because you could easily bleed the ink if you spray too much water. I was so impressed with the Oxide inks on the crumb cake that I went ahead and stamped the worn lipstick and the fossilized amber. You can see how pretty and vibrant the colors are. I would definitely recommend the Oxide inks for stamping on the crumb cake. Next, I'm going to try black cardstock. Now, I'm not even going to try a dye ink here because I know it's not going to work. So we're going to try the Distress Oxide Spice Marmalade again. I'm going to stamp it twice, and you can see as soon as you stamp it, it looks kind of bright, but then it immediately starts to fade. You can see I got a similar result from the Avery Elle pigment ink. So looking up close here, you can see that the Oxide ink is not the magic ink that's going to work really well on black cardstock. So I went ahead, just like I did with the crumb cake, and I cut off the first one of the Oxide ink so I could spritz it with water. And you can see I'm getting a really nice light mist from pretty far away. And unfortunately, it really didn't improve anything by spritzing it with water. It just made it more white. So I kind of lost that orange hint that I had. So I wouldn't recommend stamping it on black cardstock. Next, I'm going to do some watercoloring. I'm going to do a comparison side by side between the Oxide inks and the regular Distress dye inks. I've already stamped my Artful Flower by Simon Says Stamp in VersaFine Black Onyx, and I clear embossed it. I'm using Canson XL mixed media paper and my aqua painter from Stampin' Up. So I'm going to start with the oxides, and I'm going to put a little bit on my craft mat, and I'm going to pick it up with my aqua painter and put it onto my cardstock. I'm going to start by coloring my whole petal with the worn lipstick, and I can tell you at first glance it's very chalky and kind of thick and more opaque than you would get with the regular Distress dye inks. So I'm going to leave that first petal to dry so I can see how the fired brick applied to it will blend the color. So I'm going to work on this second petal here, and I'm just putting the fired brick into the shadow areas, and actually looks really nice. It blends really well. It's very similar to how the regular Distress inks work. I'd say just they look a little bit different, but they function very similar. They blend super easily because they're not really absorbing very much into the paper. So they're sort of laying on top, and you can add more color to it. You can blend it a little bit more. And I'm really not that worried about the water staining because it's not drying very quickly. So now I'm adding some fired brick to the shadow area here, and you can see that it goes on really nicely. And then now I'm wiping it off so that I can blend with just some plain water. And it blends beautifully, so it looks really nice. I'm going to go ahead and finish up these other two petals here. I'm going to fast forward this pretty quickly just for the sake of time because I'm doing the same thing as I did in the other petals. All right, now I'm going to slow it here because I'm going to add another layer of color, and you can see how easy it is to do this. So you can get these pigment or these Oxide inks to go on really dark with just a tiny little bit of water, and it really adds a nice shadow effect. Now remember, I was letting that very first petal dry before I added my second color. So now I'm putting down some fired brick and I'm blending it, and I am having no problems whatsoever. So even if the ink dries on your cardstock, it's easily reactivated with the water. So that'll do it for the Oxide inks. I'm going to move on to my dye inks now. So I've already put my dye inks onto the cardstock, and you can see compared to putting the Oxide inks on, they go on much lighter, so much more diluted. Not quite so opaque, very translucent. So I'm just going to go, and I left that first one after the first layer, and I'm going back in with some fired brick here, and I'm going to use my tissue to wipe off my brush whenever I want to go back in with some clean water to kind of blend things out. I'm going to go ahead and really speed this up because, to be honest, it applies almost exactly the same as the Oxide inks. It's just that it looks a little different. So once I finish, I'm going to hold this up and you can see the differences, but you can already tell that the flower on the left is much more chalky looking, I guess you could say. The Oxide ink is much softer and more subtle. What it sort of brings to mind to me, if you know anything about music, is the dye inks are sort of like a major chord and the Oxide inks are a minor chord. So I think the dye is just a little bit more colorful and vibrant. Next, I'm going to do some backgrounds. So I had these round foam applicators that I actually didn't like. So I put them off to the side and now I brought them out to use them since I needed some fresh applicators for the Oxide inks. And I'm also using this Sukaneko sponge applicator. Now I have to tell you that this is where I think the Distress Oxide inks really shine, is with the ink blending. They go on incredibly smooth, very easy. The ink moves around. It's nothing like the Distress ink, the dye inks, where you get all sorts of square marks or circle marks or whatever based on your sponge. And it goes on really heavy too. So with the Distress inks, I tend to put layer and layer and layer and go lighter and lighter, then darker, and it takes a lot of time. You can see I whipped through this really quickly. And so this was really impressive to me, and look at how even the application is. Now I have some Spice Marmalade. Now doing the middle color was always a problem with the ink applicators with the Distress ink, because you want to start off the cardstock, yet you're kind of in the middle of it. But when you're applying the Distress Oxides, you don't have to start off the cardstock. You could start in the middle of the cardstock. And if you get like a line from your applicator, you can just blend over it. And it really spreads the color out. And it's really nice and smooth. So once I get all of this Spice Marmalade on, I'm going to go back in with my worn lipstick and I'm going to blend it again over, because you can add multiple layers of color. So sometimes when you're doing this with Distress inks, it's hard to add a second color, just kind of gets darker. And for this, you can actually see the new worn lipstick that's going on top of the Spice Marmalade. And so you can get a really nice graduation of color from pink to orange. Now I'm going to use the Fossilized Amber, which is actually much brighter than I thought it was going to be. So this is a really pretty yellow. I was kind of disappointed that they used the Fossilized Amber for the yellow color, but I actually really like it. So I'm just going to do the same exact thing I've been doing on the other two, which is just applying it. I'm using my Sukaneko sponge, and it works almost identical to the ink foam applicator that I was just using. I was just really surprised how quick and easy this was. And I do a lot of this dry ink blending because I'm not a huge fan of the messy background, and I'm going to do that in a little bit here. But I like the smooth backgrounds, and you can get a really nice effect with these Oxide inks. So now I'm going to go back in with my Spice Marmalade and just go over that edge between that and the Fossilized Amber and just get those colors really going, because they're not really absorbing into the paper. They're sort of laying on top of the paper, which is why you're able to move them around and blend them so beautifully. So here's the final result. It's totally awesome, honestly. So I'm going to cut this in half because I want to spritz it with water. But first I'm sort of noticing the texture here. It is a little bit chalky. Nothing's coming off on my finger, but it feels different. Off camera, I did ink blending with my dye inks so we could compare. The dye inks are very, very smooth, and the Oxide inks are a little chalky. I'm not sure it really bothers me. Nobody's really going to be feeling the card that much. But you can see the difference in the colors here. It's not nearly as smooth, and it's quite uneven, actually. You've got too much orange in the middle where that dark spot is, and it's not as pretty. And I actually used scattered straw at the bottom. Remember, I didn't have the Fossilized Amber. Anyway, so let's spritz half of this Oxide ink panel and see what happens. I'm going to spray it pretty liberally this time because I'm not worried about stamped images bleeding. And you can see almost immediately that the colors get really muted and they fade with like kind of a whitish substance on it, which is the oxidizing. And there's dots, there's texture on it as well. So let's compare these two Oxide ink panels. Honestly, I like both of them. They're very different. If you want more of a subtle background with a little texture, you can add water, or you could just leave it without water, and I think it looks beautiful. Now you can also stamp on these with water. So I'm going to remove the spritzed piece, and now I have my dye and my Oxide ink that does not have water. I'm going to take my Artful Flower and I'm going to spray it. I'm going to do it off camera here. Spray it with water, not too much water because then you'll get thick lines from your stamp. It'll start spreading. And so I'm going to stamp my Oxide piece, and then I'm going to stamp my dye ink piece. So let's take a look at these two pieces up close. You can see that you get much more ink removed from the Oxide side than the dye side. And if I had added even more water, I would get a more prominent image. So this is a really fun technique to use. This is probably my favorite part of the whole review. So I've already stamped and embossed with white embossing powder this hand-drawn hearts background by Simon Says Stamp. And I'm going to do direct to paper here. So I've got my wilted violet and I'm just going to press down onto my cardstock, and it goes on really quick and really easy. And part of the reason I wanted to do this is I wanted to see if it would stain my embossed areas, because a lot of times the inks will stain and then you don't get that pretty white color that kind of stands out when you do some resist here. So now I'm going to take the broken china. I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm trying not to get too thick of a line. So I'm using the corner a little bit, but it goes on so easy. It's really not a problem. And I'm overlapping them a little bit, but not too much, because they just, the blue will go on top of the purple. So I'm just really putting it on so that they pretty much touch each other. My final color is the cracked pistachio. I'm glad that that's part of the color lineup. It's such a pretty color. So I'm going to finish the bottom off here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, I've got a sponge applicator, one of those Tsukaneko ones that I was using earlier, and I'm going to blend over the lines between those two colors. So I'm going to start with the broken china, which is the lighter of the two between the blue and the purple. And so I'm just going to kind of go over that line between the two colors, and it's almost magical how it just all blends together. It's like the ink has not been absorbed into the paper, so it's all laying on top, and so you don't get any weird lines or anything like that. It just blends the two colors. Now I probably should have switched out my ink applicator, because I do have a little bit of purple and blue on here, but it wasn't enough to really make it look bad. So now I'm taking my green, I'm just going over the line between the pistachio and the broken china. Now there is quite a bit of ink on my hearts, so I just took a clean tissue and it just came right off, and you can see how bright my white embossing powder looks now. And I think that this was probably my favorite technique that I'm going to be using the most with these Distress Oxide inks. It just looks so pretty, it blends so well, and it was so easy. You saw how dark and vibrant the colors were when I first applied it. So there you go, works great with direct to paper. I did want to mention that the inks are pretty messy, so I went ahead and washed my hands so you can see like how much comes off. And you can see it comes off pretty easily, so it doesn't stain your hands as much as the Distress inks do. I'm bringing back my previous panels because I wanted to see, this is the dye on the left and the Oxide on the right, and the Oxide almost feels just like the dye now, so you just have to let it dry for a little while. Next, I'm going to work on a background that's kind of random, so where you don't have kind of a graduated rainbow of color. So I'm going to take my worn lipstick and I'm just going to apply it in different areas on my cardstock. Now I'm using Nina Solar White cardstock right now. I'm not using watercolor paper, and I will use watercolor paper in a minute. So now I'm going to take my Spice Marmalade, I'm going to add some here and there, and you can see that I'm really not doing that great of a job of blending. I'm just sort of laying down my color on the cardstock. And then finally I'll take some fossilized amber and fill in all the gaps. It's an interesting background. You could leave it like this if you wanted to, but I'm going to spritz it with water. So I'm going to put quite a bit of water on it just to see what happens. And when you use Nina cardstock for something like this, the water just soaks in really quickly. And so there's really not a lot of water movement. And I'm going to use my heat tool to let this dry quickly, but there's not a lot of water movement, so you don't get a lot of like water staining or colors blending together. You do get that kind of oxidized look. It's already muting the color that I had down. And since I can layer color with these Oxide inks, I'm going to go back in with the same colors, mostly in the same areas, just darkening up the color. So I'm going to speed through this. I'm just putting it on exactly like I put it on earlier. You can see it definitely looks darker because I added more ink. And so now I'm going to spritz it again with the water, and then I'm going to use my heat tool to dry it. You can see again, not a whole lot of water movement, and you can see the colors are fading as it's fast forwarding, but it's a really nice, pretty, subtle background. So you don't get any of those applicator lines that I had when I was applying the color. So it all blended out and it looks nice. I'm going to do the same exact thing I just did, except I'm going to use watercolor paper. So I'm going to speed through the application of these colors because I'm doing the exact same thing I did. Now they go on even smoother, if you can imagine, on watercolor paper. So you don't get any of those blocky lines or anything when you're doing this. Right now I'm spritzing it with water, and you can see it's already reacting. because it does absorb. There is some dye in these inks, so when you apply them to regular cardstock, they are going to absorb somewhat into the cardstock. But when you have watercolor paper, it just lets things lay on top for a little while and blend and move around. So you get more of a watercolor look when you're doing this. So I'm going to fast forward as I'm doing this heat tool drying. I'm using a tissue here and there to kind of wipe up some of the puddles of water. You can see how pretty. Now I've got some water staining and the colors are moving around a lot more. So now I'm going to take my inks again and I'm going to apply a second layer of color. And you can see it's getting a lot darker, and then I'm going to spritz it again, and then I'm going to dry it up with my heat tool. You can see there's even more water movement now, and my heat tool is kind of moving it around. And I'm getting some water staining, and you can see when it's in fast motion that it really does fade the color with these Oxide inks when you add water. So let's compare this to the Nina. There's definitely more texture, there's more, it's just a little more striking with the watercolor paper, just because you get those water stains. It's not quite so subtle. So just different purposes. Now, this product review is really about how different are these Oxide inks. So what I'm doing now is I'm doing the same exact thing again. I'm using my watercolor paper, but I'm using dye ink, so just the regular distress inks. I've got the same colors, except of course I'm using scattered straw instead of fossilized amber. And you know, actually the fossilized amber, when you add water to it, it almost looks just like the scattered straw. You can see that I'm getting more of the blocky look than I did earlier because the distress inks are just not quite as easy to blend. Okay, so now I'm going to spritz this with water, and then I'll use my heat tool to dry it. And you'll see that it looks very similar to the Oxide inks, and they reacted very similarly as far as movement on the paper and drying and blending together. So I'm just going to fast forward this really quick. So you can see I did 2 layers of color like I did with the other samples. So let's compare the results. So I have Oxide on the left and dye on the right. It's very similar as far as texture goes, but the colors are much more subtle. The pinks are lighter on the left than they are on the right. You're just getting more color. So it's just something a little bit different. And now here's the Nina one that I did at the beginning. And you can see that the 2 left ones look very similar. They're much more subtle and muted and softer. All right, this is the last thing I'm going to do. I'm going to put some water splatters on all 3 of these to see what happens. So I'm just grabbing the nozzle from my spritz bottle and I'm just going to tap it with my finger, and I'm going to do that on all 3 of these. Okay, now I'm going to take a tissue and wipe up my splatters. And you can see on my Nina Oxide, it reacted a little bit, but really not that much. With the watercolor paper, with the oxides and the dye inks, they did exactly the same thing. The dots look just the same. They're white. Yeah, there's not much difference between the water splatters on the Oxide ink versus the dye ink, which I thought was really interesting. Here's an up-close comparison of the Oxide ink with the dye ink. And to be honest, they're really not that much different. The oxides are just a little softer and lighter. All right, so let's wrap up all the ways we looked at using these inks. For stamping, you get a nice, good, solid image, but not quite as crisp as a true pigment ink. But it does give better coverage than some of the dye inks. For sentiment stamping, it's a little splotchy and not as good as a true pigment ink such as VersaFine or a dye ink. For heat embossing, it heat embosses really well. But I wouldn't say it's anything special over regular distress ink or other pigment inks. Works really well for blending on stamps where you're stamping multiple times with different colors. I wouldn't spritz it with water on white cardstock. It just doesn't seem to change it very much. You can definitely watercolor with it. It works great. It blends beautifully. Just know that your colors are going to be a little more muted and maybe a little chalky as compared to regular dye ink. Works great on craft cardstock or crumb cakes cardstock. You can spritz it with water to get a lighter color. It looks beautiful, but you just have to be careful and use a light hand with the water. It doesn't really do anything miraculous on black paper. It performs just as well as any other pigment ink in that it really doesn't stamp very well on black cardstock. Ink blending is where these Oxide inks really start to shine. They have a nice smooth color and it's really fast and really easy as compared to just plain old distress inks. and then you can spritz it with water for a more textured look or just a lighter color. You can stamp with water on top of the blended inks for a really cool effect. And then there's my favorite, direct to paper ink blending. It's easy, it's fast, and the results are gorgeous. And finally, backgrounds. I was able to get some really cool looking backgrounds with the Oxide inks, but I could also layer my dye inks as long as I let them dry in between. So I'm not sure you're gaining that much more with the Oxide inks, but if you really like creating backgrounds like this might be a nice set of inks to experiment with. All right, so that'll do it for my review. I hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.